Okay. Call this meeting of the Finance Committee to order. Sorry for starting late. And looking at the agenda here, a number of pieces of legislation, finance update. But first, the minutes from our last meeting, just last week. Take a look at them. Okay, is there a second? That
I'm sorry?
the minutes? You
The minutes.
need a second?
Yes, the minutes. I have reviewed them, Mr. Chairman, and would move to approve.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much for that housekeeping there. We have one GA 2817, Maryland State Arts Council. Do you have anybody? Thank you.
Mickey Blitzer, Finance Department. GA 2817 is a grant awarded from the Maryland State Arts Council. It is technically awarded to the Arts Council of Anne Arundel County. They're working with the Arts and Public Places Commission, so we have a subrecipient agreement between the Arts Council and Arts and Public Places. Yes, it is. So there's a subrecipient agreement between the Arts and Public Places Commission and the Arts Council of Anne Arundel County. It is to create a tile mosaic wall based along a short-standing wall at the end of Compromise Street. The project is going to be, I think she titled it Blue Sails. So it'll be a tile piece there, and it'll have a nice entryway into the downtown area.
Okay. And the match, it looks like, is...
Yeah, so the grant is for $5,000. It does require a match of $5,000, which has been identified in the Rec and Parks operating budget.
Is that what variance means?
No, I'm sorry. That's on the new sheet. The second column is budgeted grant appropriation. So sometimes, well, most of our grants are included in the budget. This one was not. So the variance is the difference between the budget versus this grant.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on?
No questions.
Okay. Move approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Nikki. And then we have a number of pieces of legislation. We'll start with 01417, the lease of city property, Chesapeake Marine Tours. Debbie, anything you'd like to say? Welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm here to answer any questions that you might have and request your support for this ordinance.
Great. So obviously the term is sort of pushed out a little farther than as we've done in the past. People are familiar with that, so it's an encouraging development. Is there any questions or comments about specifics?
Well, can you explain why the 4 years this time, or 5 years? 4 years, I guess, as opposed to the 1 or 2 that we normally do way in advance?
It is in keeping with most commercial leases to have longer than 1 year lease. We have a tremendous amount of overhead that we invest in. We have 13 boats altogether. It requires a tremendous amount of work and money, and we need the security for more than a 1 year lease to be able to continue to make those investments. It's something that council members and the mayor have talked about for a number of years. There was a thought for some time that the council may not have been allowed to do more than a 1 year lease, and I think that has finally been overcome. And I really appreciate it. I think that many on the council appreciate it also, because it's time. It's a lot of resources for a number of people. We are entering our 46th season of working in Annapolis and inviting people here to spend money, and it'll give us that much time to be able to do it better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Alderman Arnett?
Thank you. So this is, in my mind, consistent with the same logic we're using for the boat show leases. And it obviously makes it easier to do, excuse me while I plug in here, to do business, get loans, those sorts of things.
And attract employees.
Pardon me?
And attract employees.
Right. The one, this is an uncomfortable question to ask, but suppose something goes awry, the relationship breaks down. Is there any opt-out options for either you or for the city in this lease?
The default is an opt-out if we are in default.
That's it?
Yes.
Okay. Other questions or comments, or
No questions.
we have a motion?
I move that this, I move for a favorable recommendation by this committee.
Sorry, one more
Sure.
question.
Sure.
Did we get the hawkers and peddlers stuff straightened out?
Yes. Thank
Okay.
you.
I second the motion.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
So then we have the two Market House resolutions, 016 and 017. If I talk about them together, but Joe, would you like to talk about these as they're your legislation?
Sure, happy to. The 016 proposes a open system for requesting bids for the Market House. Listed in the ordinance are the terms that I've cribbed from earlier RFPs on the Market House, as well as a little bit of my own spin on them. To lease the Market House essentially on a triple net basis, and find a tenant who will operate the Market House for us. My approach, my philosophical approach is we've tried having the city manage it. In the early days, we brought in the vendors directly. We tried a master tenant, and that didn't work. That had complications largely through parts of the deal that were unspecified and unspecified assumptions. And then we tried having a middleman do it, and that didn't work very well either. I'm proposing that we go back towards a master tenant relationship, but be a lot more careful about who we pick and how we structure the deal, so that it's clear to them that here it is, it's your problem, don't call us if you don't like the way it's working. You've got to put the money in to fix it. The city would retain responsibility for the structure itself, for the exterior, including the roof, and the rest of it would be the tenant's responsibility. We would charge the previous deals that certainly in my time following the Market House have all asked for some percentage of sales and all kinds of crazy formulas. I discussed this with the Director of Finance, and we feel that a simple rent system is a much preferable way to go. This is a public amenity. It's not trying to be a major profit center for the city. It's supposed to be an attraction for our residents, and our visitors, and employees that work here in town. And so as long as we cover our costs out of it and come slightly ahead of that, we're good. So we're proposing that as a working model. The finance director proposed that we set a rent, or ask for a rent that is equivalent to what an organization would be paying, a private organization would be paying in taxes if they had owned the building. The building isn't in SDAT, so we're going to have to figure out, do an estimate of what that might look like, but that's the philosophical approach. The second bill talks about,
Can we stay on this one?
yeah,
Please? All right, so, the valuation of this building is gonna come up in the legislation after these two. But, well, the taking them out of the enterprise funds and into the, general fund, and I need to know what kinds of monies we're talking about there. So, but can you explain the triple net lease more fully? I see all the words here, but I don't see triple. I see a gazillion different things if you take rent, utilities, repair, maintenance, taxes, da-da-da. So what is that concept?
triple net, correct me if I stray here, Mr. Director. Triple net means that the tenant pays a base rent plus they pay taxes, insurance, and maintenance.
Okay, but there's words like utilities, repairs in here also.
Yeah.
So triple net in this case is defined as paying rent, whatever we establish that on, utilities, repair, maintenance, taxes,
Mhm.
insurance, and the city only retains the responsibility of the roof, structural elements, and exterior services. So we no longer have responsibility for HVAC
Correct,
or any of the other internal
correct,
kinds of things. Wiring?
correct.
Okay. So we make sure the roof doesn't leak and the exterior and the metal columns are all
And the
structural
building
sound.
stands up, yep.
Okay. And just as I asked Debbie, will there be a contract that we will see and that will explain reasons for terminating the lease?
Yes, the first step in this is soliciting the RFP and the second step is the council selecting a vendor or a tenant. And then the third step is the administration negotiating a lease with the tenant, which by charter has to come back to the council for approval via an ordinance.
Okay. It seems so simple.
Okay, Mr. Finance Director, is there anything you want to add on? Okay. Has Economic Matters taken this up yet? Has it referred to them?
We have not. We will be taking it up, I believe, next Monday.
Okay. Do we want to talk about the second one, or you want to deal with this one? Okay.
The second one goes hand in hand with the first. The first is all about how we select a tenant. And part of the selection process says you shall operate or part of the RFP says you shall operate the market house according to the city statute. So we want to make sure that the city statute matches up with with what we want to have happening there. And so we're getting rid of some of the language about how we will take care of the HVAC and clean, and how we have this intermediate manager. We're getting him out of the picture. And then there's just some editorial isn't quite the right word, technical maneuver changes. There was a whole section in the open air markets part of the code that talked about what you could and couldn't do in the market house. Well, the market house is not an open air market. And there was a whole section in the market house part about the tenant being able to have an open air market. So we swapped those around. And that's essentially what the second bill is accomplishing.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
So, and we ran into this early in my tenure on the council with Alderman Israel. There is a section, I believe in city code, but also state law, that says that you cannot have an open-air market. You have to operate within 4 enclosed walls. Do we feel that this overcomes that problem?
We have had an open-air market and for years.
Tut. Doesn't make any difference what we've had, it's what this.
Well, no, I don't know what Alderman Israel may have been referencing. We've had an open-air market in Eastport for a number of years. We've had the Fresh Farm Market in the Donner Lot for a decade and a half, something like that. There was a concern, I know at one point we were talking in the Laird Jackson days, we were talking about having openable windows and stuff, and there were health laws at that time that prohibited that. But signs are that there's more flexibility in that now. Restaurants such as Preserve and Level have figured out how to work that with openable fronts, openable front windows. And we encourage here the tenant to explore that option at his expense, thinking that that may be a more, make it a more attractive facility, but I'm not proposing that the city sink any more pennies into the Market House.
Well, this is not Market House, right? This legislation is open-air markets.
Well, it's both.
It's both.
But the open-air market is to me at least, is kind of the new part of this.
Right.
And in reviewing it, seems like a good idea.
I guess, I wish we had the Office of Law here, because I'm making the assumption that by putting this into code, we're obviating that section, and maybe David.
That code was there. It was already in the code.
I know,
And
but
I'm
there's-
simply moving it from
Right.
one section to another.
I still remember, and this was used as the base, I think it was somehow involved with the rooftop dining, actually, where there was a section of code that says that you cannot do things unless it's within 4 walls. So it could be that this and earlier legislation has overcome that by putting in code in certain places you can do that, whereas in other places you can't. But I really want to make sure that we are not going to be passing this and violating another part of the code. So
Well, if
Bruce
you
went down
can't
to see
do
if
something
someone's-
unless it's within 4 walls, there are an awful lot of sidewalk cafes.
Sidewalk cafes
downtown that-
do have specific code, and that may well be that this also, like doing the sidewalk cafes, overrides that general rule because we've put it in specifically. I just want to make sure. So it would be nice to hear from the Office of Law. There was nothing in Ashley's statement, in fact, there was virtually nothing in Ashley's statement, period, but certainly nothing speaking to that, and that could well be because she was relatively new and wasn't aware of all that brouhaha. It's one of the reasons why we re-elect people to the council, for better or for worse. Let me just go on to some other kind of questions.
Let's do that. Bruce, I think, was going
Yeah.
down to see if someone was the Office.
Would this allow, like, truck farmers to back up in Hopkins Plaza or someplace else and have, and sell produce off the back of the truck like they do at Eastern Market in Washington?
The way I worded it, they could do that if it was organized by the tenant. We have an open-air market that can take place over in the Donner Lot that has nothing to do with the Market House tenant, but if you want to use Hopkins Plaza for your open-air market, you have to coordinate it with the Market House tenant or do it through them.
But this covers from 110 Compromise through Hopkins Plaza.
Except See line 8, page 2, line 18, excluding the Alfred A. Hopkins Plaza.
Ah, I didn't see excluding. So.
So
no
that's,
is
so
in-
that's paragraphs A and B cover the existing, farmers markets that we've had in town.
Okay,
C says if the tenant of the market house wants to have an open-air market in Hopkins Plaza, he can, as long as the Director of Public Works is happy with it.
okay, all right. So Ashley, the question was, and this came up with regard to rooftop dining, but there is a section in, I believe in our code, but also in, I guess it's just our code, that says that you cannot operate a commercial venture outside of 4 enclosing walls. And I don't remember what it was, I just remember that that was a big brouhaha for Jerry's Seafood first on Main Street, and then over with the rooftop dining at Blackwall Hitch. But I guess the question is, if we say in code that you can have these open-air markets, and we have said in code you can have sidewalk markets, even if there's a general overriding rule that says you have to, and I do think it came from state law, that you have to operate within 4 walls, if we put this in, that overrides whatever that section is?
It would depend if it was state law or ours and what the, I mean, because I know that, I've read the section about the open air markets, I'm not aware of the 4 walls thing, whether that's related to health code or is that just a zoning? I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, I can't remember,
and
it was quite
compare.
a...
Because it would depend how it reads. If the state is really expressed, then no, city code can't overrule state law. If this is something else within our own code, then it would just be a contradiction we would need to fix.
Clearly, we've done it
I mean,
because there are
I'm-
rooftop dining.
I'm
but-
not aware of something in state law that would say that, considering almost every city in the state has rooftop dining establishments.
Yeah, I just,
The
And open-
C2 and the C2A code both say that that business shall primarily be conducted within the 4 walls.
maybe that's how Jerry's Seafood
But
got it.
that would be how Jerry's Seafood and
Okay.
Rooftop.
Yeah, I
But-
mean, that
but-
might be.
But
I
that's
mean,
not a citywide, state-imposed kind of thing. That's
Right.
purely our zone.
Okay,
I could see that making sense, but I couldn't see it being an absolute, just because so many businesses have exterior pieces to them. But I mean, I can look into it.
well, I kind of feel we're okay, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah,
If-
I mean,
If you could check on it, we're taking it up in Economic Matters on the 10th.
okay,
And if we could get an answer by then, it'd be great.
I will see what I can track down.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming up on.
Oh, no, I was gonna be here earlier, I just got bogged down into a document and didn't realize it was 12:30 already. But I'm happy to do it, because I was planning to stay up here anyway.
Okay, Ross, do you have other questions for the sponsor?
Well, I have a comment.
Okay.
The comment is, thank you. This is long overdue, and I hope it will get us beyond people saying, remember the market house? So, appreciate your efforts.
Sure. Alderman
Yeah.
Mayo?
Yeah, I looked at this and kind of pen in hand with a pad of paper, ready to write down all the questions I had. I mean, what about this? What about that? I think you pretty much covered everything I thought of. Great job.
Well, thanks also to the city staff who, purchasing and legal and public works and a bunch of folks sat down with me and helped me through this, because everybody who's been through these wars before has no desire to
Go through them again.
So, we've fully addressed all the comments we got during public comment at the council meeting?
Yes.
I can't believe no one.
And just as sort of a frame of reference, if you hadn't done all this good work and bring this forward, so it'll be, before us, what What is the timeline of action playing out at the Market House in the absence of this?
The timeline of in the absence of these two pieces of legislation, it would be at the mayor's discretion to let out an RFP for the Market House and bring a proposed lease back to the council at some point. His and it would be like in prior instances where the mayor and his team pick whoever they think is best for us.
Sure.
And after a number of attempts at that, if we're going to make a mistake in selection, I want it to be a public process and a public mistake.
Well said. Thank you.
In terms of the financial impact, I mean, this says we won't know until we do a lease. Do we have a ballpark estimate of what we think this will do financially? This question is going to come up over and over. It'll come up with the next piece of legislation. What do we think that building is worth?
Well, I don't have a market analysis, to tell you the truth, and typically you have three different ways to value a piece of property. You know, one of the things that we might want to do is get a value put on it, have an appraiser appraise the property. I know we did that probably about 6-7 years ago now, but it might be an appropriate step to take. So where will we come out? I think Alderman Budge was talking about it earlier when we were looking at and comparing prior rental agreements and how that was enforced, trying to get information relative to net sales, gross sales, whatever, you know, the sales activities are with different vendors, to keep it relatively straightforward, whereby it would be a triple net lease with a rental based on some type of value. You know, I'm just looking at if that was a, you know, what I'm looking at perspective is if that was a piece of property that was on a private entity owned, what would be the real estate tax? Because that's what the city would earn from it. What the city, you know, so I'm looking at it from that versus trying to get into all the different
All right, well,
markets.
let me stop you. Say it's worth $1 million.
Okay.
What's the rent we would charge?
Well, you would apply the tax rate on that, so $60,000.
And then that would be divided up over 12 months.
Or a lump sum payment, or
So, compared to a $4.7 billion budget or whatever the mayor proposed last night, this is small in the scheme of revenue. No, even if it was worth $5 million, we're not talking about a big.
well, I think the what you do take off the table a little bit though is the operating costs associated with it. So there are opportunity gains, if you will, that the city does not incur.
Okay, so those are the kinds of things that would be helpful to have in a financial impact note. But my sense is we're doing this largely to relieve ourselves of a hassle where our staff are trying to our staff of engineers are trying to manage something that is a business, a retail business, and they have better things to do with their time, and if we put somebody who's at risk doing it, they're probably going to do a better job of managing it also. So would that be a fair summary, that one of the major thrusts of this is to get it in the hands of the right people to manage, and that the income is sort of icing on the cake, but it's not going to be huge?
Yes, yeah. To put your question in perspective, the Market House is presently, well, this is as of 1/30, so it's approximately half the year The revenues were 81,000, so we're looking at 150 something for the year. And expenses are, our expenses now are slightly less than that, not including debt service and so forth, and depreciation and whatnot, just the regular expense. And, we let the tenant take over that, and we'll probably realize less in rent, but fine. I would much rather have a tenant down there being successful and making money than trying to get every last possible nickel into the city coffers out of the market house.
So depreciation and debt service are expenses that'll go on irrespective of this. Right.
We'll take
We'll
that
be
up
talking about in the
a
next
bit more in the
legislation.
next bill, but
Yes.
depreciation has gone away, debt service, yeah, that's part of the general fund debt.
Well, depreciation hasn't gone away, it's just transferred to someplace else.
No, it's gone away.
Because the renter's paying for it?
No. Magic of
Oh.
government accounting.
It's, oof, you're no longer an asset. Is that really right? We'll talk about it in the next one.
Yeah.
Okay, so on 01617, are there any other questions or comments or a motion?
Move, we recommend approval to the council?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And the related piece, 01717.
I recommend approval.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Thank you.
01917, the removal of the dock and Market House Enterprise Funds. Sure. Okay. Sure. Okay. Yeah, let's do the special event. Welcome.
Felicia Nolan, Special Events Coordinator.
Excellent. So, I guess when we were talking about this at the last meeting, right? And has there been any development since then that we, I know there was some conversation about
St. Patrick's
about
Day.
St. Patrick's Day Parade.
St. Patrick's Day, yeah.
There was, and I've been unable to sit down with Mr. O'Leary and speak with him about adding that to our list here. I suppose there's nothing that says we can't add someone to this list, although we don't believe we've done that before, but I think we could if we wanted to.
Certainly.
I would anticipate being able to speak with him sometime in the next few days, and I should know something perhaps even before this comes up for a council vote.
Well, let me offer a countervailing argument, because when you look at the two different kinds of events, the first ones are city-sponsored because they contribute to the heritage and public service of the community, while I, being 50% Irish, certainly love parades to celebrate that. I'm hard-pressed to figure out how it's part of the city of Annapolis's heritage. It is in Savannah, Georgia. Apparently there was a huge Irish population, and it is a huge ongoing institutional thing, and their parties are overwhelmingly big. And so therefore, I'd have a hard time convincing myself to put it in that first section, and then the second section are really events that we want to waive the fees. So if it was going to go anywhere, it would go in that section, a fee waiver. But that was the whole point of talking to the sponsor, was even desirous of having fees waived. I'd be surprised they, oh no, keep charging you fees, but on the other hand, and I guess then it gets to sort of a philosophical discussion of what is the basis for waiving fees? Why don't we waive fees for everybody? Or why do we waive fees at all? I don't think we're ready. I guess my one solace is that if we have some discussion, we can always come back with legislation then amends this section of the code and add them if we want to. But I do think that every time we get into this, and certainly we did it in Legions when we were talking about special events, is what's the underlying philosophy for why we're doing this? Either making it city-sponsored or waiver of fees. And remembering that these events do cost us a real chunk of change, and particularly for police and fire overtime. So, yeah, how much do we want to be in the business of waiving fees?
Like to make one small vocabulary correction. All of these events listed on this resolution are city-sponsored because the city in one way or another is underwriting them. Think of it in the same terms as sponsorship of a magazine or a baseball game or something like that. If you're a sponsor, it doesn't mean it's it just means you're contributing. The top list on here are city organized events that Ms. Nolan puts in the sweat equity to organize and make sure everything works. The second list are events that are organized by outside parties. The city simply sponsors, and we sponsor through waiving fees or other kinds of, in this case it's by waiving fees. The film festival conceptually could be on here, except they don't have to apply for a special event, but we provide trolley service for them. It's in-kind service. And most of the events, some of the events on here are clearly cultural. Others are events that have a large beneficial economic impact on our city. The Grand Illumination is kind of a cross of those, but the Lights Parade, and the Tug of War we support because of their economic impact. And
But we don't organize those.
no, we don't. They're not city organized, but they are city sponsored.
So why wouldn't they be in the second list?
They are in the second list.
No. I'm looking at line, on page 3, and I don't want to call down fire on the tug of war, but it's line 1 under the first grouping on page
Look at
3.
lines 17 and 18 on page 3.
17 and 18.
I'm looking at 12 through 15. Oh, the tug of war is line 17.
I'm trying to understand the
Yeah,
construction.
your point is that it's the definition that the tug of war is not run by Ms. Nolan, so where some of these other ones are are directed by the city.
Well, everything,
But-
lines 12 through 18 are all talking about events that are organized by folks
By
outside
someone
of
else.
city government.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, the tug of war is outside of city government.
Yeah, they're in line 18.
Well, but they're also up here on page 2, or page 3, line 1.
Yes.
It's probably
There's
not-
two
not-
groupings of events here.
Getting stuck on.
The first cluster, Independence Day Parade, Kunta Kinte, Tug of War, Grand Illumination.
Yes, that's a list of everything that is city sponsored.
So everything in the
So-
resolution.
Okay.
If,
And the second, and many of which are organized by the city.
But not all.
But
The
not all.
organization is not the criteria for them being in the
Yes.
list.
Alderman Arnett, if
Mhm.
you, like the second grouping that has the 4, that's if the full fees are waived. If the next line is just talking about the tug of war, because only parking's waived for tug of war. So that's why like tug of war is not listed in the second grouping, but it's right underneath of that.
But we don't have to waive fees for city organized events, because we can't waive fees for ourselves.
No
Right.
fees to begin with. Right.
So the Kunta Kinte Festival in the second grouping, do we waive all fees for that?
Yes,
And the Grand Illumination?
correct.
The Lights Parade?
Yes.
No. We waive all for the light
Yes.
spray? So it's only, I'm really having a hard time distinguishing the difference between the two lists, but you're happy to live with it? I'm not.
Very happy.
All right, I don't care. So this is just renewal of the
Like,
special events.
right, and the only difference, like I had mentioned last week, the only difference was the Navy band concerts are not this year, but that's normally on this list as well.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
Not at this
I
point.
think my sense, since there hasn't been that communication, obviously we could do that at the full council if there's an appetite to do it, if that's,
Sure, this will come to the
Yeah.
full council in, end of April, on the 24th. And if you've been able to talk to Mr. O'Leary between now and then, I would certainly welcome an amendment to, add that to the list.
sounds good. It's a good way to handle it. Any other questions or comments on R 1217?
I think anyone that has participated in the St. Patrick's Day Parade, and frankly, most of those that have maybe not participated but watched the parade would agree that this is something that brings so many people to downtown Annapolis on what would otherwise be the off-season, that it is clearly worth our while to include this, but at least in some form. And I will be speaking with Mr. O'Leary. And
Was that a motion?
well, not at this point,
Okay.
but
We'll do it at the full council.
you actually started to talk about that way back when you began speaking on this issue, and I just thought I'd give you a relatively brief answer, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
I move that for favorable recommendation.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much. Thank you. And the final bit of legislation is 01917. Where do we want to start? Joe, you want to,
So, sure. This ordinance, or the need for this ordinance bubbled up as I was preparing the Market House legislation. The Market House legislation itself, the Market House section of the code called for an enterprise fund. And doing a global search on Market House through our code, it was like, oh, look, the budget section of the code calls for an enterprise fund too. But I thought it would be too disruptive in a Market House bill to be tinkering with the budget, especially as we were modifying the dates of the budget submission and so forth at that time. So I introduced this as a separate bill. In last year's budgeting process, we folded the market fund and the dock fund into the general fund, but we did not update the code to reflect that we had done so. So this is simply a code update to reflect the accounting practices that the council implemented last year.
thank you. Straightforward. Any questions or comments? Alderman Pam?
Comment. It seems logical to me to keep these as enterprise funds, but since we did begin the changeover last year, but particularly since our city financial advisors have recommended that we enact this ordinance, I will support it. I'm not 100% sure that I will vote for it when it comes before the council as a whole. I mean, I might, but I've got to look into this a little bit further. But for today, I certainly support it.
Well, let's look into it a little bit further. I'm trying to recall the logic of why we
Yeah.
were doing this from the financial advisors.
All right. As way of background and setting the table, I can't speak to why the enterprise funds were created in the code. I'm assuming that they were created to segregate activities so that a profit and loss statement would be known relative to each one of these activities. An enterprise fund for accounting purposes is very specific relative to what it means. And it's, whereas the general fund, governmental funds, use a modified accrual basis of accounting. Enterprise funds are just, that's why they're called enterprises. They're business type funds, okay? They're business type activities. So they had the depreciation, for example, where you see depreciation in a business type activity, you don't see it in the governmental activity. And it was only about 15 years ago where we even started recording assets. Before that, our assets were never even on the books, okay? It was only Statement 34, GASB Statement 34, that required to add assets to the financial statements. So the accounting is catching up a little bit, but to your concern, you would think as part of a business type activity, those business type activities are profit centers. They make money. These two enterprise funds do not make money. Every year there is a subsidy from the general fund to these enterprise funds, okay? And primarily because of the, especially on the dock fund, the bulkhead and other big bonds were allocated to these enterprise funds. You take the depreciation on that, you take the debt service on that, it's not going to make money. It just can't. It can't support enough revenue to have a net positive bottom line. Market House, very similar type of situation. It wasn't making revenues, so in discussion with the auditors regarding our transportation fund and the two other activities, it was decided that step one, the dock fund and the market fund needed to be pulled into the general fund because the probability that they were going to start making surpluses was not there. So for accounting purposes, and we had this conversation with the rating agencies, our accountants, our auditors, everybody was under the same philosophy that these two funds had to be pulled into the general fund for ongoing disclosure purposes. So they were consolidated into the general fund with this year's audit and fiscal year 16's operations budget activities. The transportation fund is a little bit different in that because they have different revenue sources, including federal and state grants, there is the potential of having a surplus when you recognize those grants. But we had to write off the accumulated deficits. So that was another part of the fiscal year 16 audit. So that was a little bit of a nuance, but that stays as an enterprise fund because that is a business type activity. So Alderman, I hope that kind of like muddies the water a little bit more, but there was rationale and reason behind it.
So the liability for the dock fund, even for just the last repair, was about $7 million. And the debt, with the investments we made in the Market House were about $6 million. And then I think there was some earlier carryover for the dock fund for the first dollar for rebulking we did.
Mm-hmm.
So those liabilities are now transferred over to the general fund.
Correct.
And the debt service payment is transferred over to the general
That's correct.
fund. So the question I was asking you before we got started is, and we should know this because we did it last year. I should know it because I was part of it last year. I was just trying to get a sense of what the cost, the new costs to the general fund are by virtue of formalizing this action and by virtue of taking this action last year.
Okay, I'm going to split the question, okay? There are two pieces of that. There are ongoing operating costs, debt service primarily, and the other operating expenditures of both. And we will provide you, I don't have that information with us, but we can definitely provide that information. The second is the consolidation. When we consolidated the enterprise funds from individual and collapsed the assets and liabilities and fund balances into the general fund. We can provide you those schedules which shows we took this much of building, this much of debt, this much of accumulated retained earnings or whatever it is, and that's what we pulled over because we have all these schedules that show that closing entry. So we can provide you that information too without
So this is
problem.
really a matter of having accounting in the business side that was always going to show and probably a growing liability versus putting it into the general government side, which folds it in, but the costs are still there, the liabilities are still there.
Yeah, the liabilities
It's
don't
just
go away.
It's better accounting.
Right. And this is where you get into the discussion to activities, revolving funds. You know, that's why the sidewalk fund is a revolving fund, separate and distinct from the general fund, but it's a governmental fund. So when you take a look at the general, when you take a look at the CAFR, you'll see that as part of the general governmental funds. It's not a distinct enterprise fund because it's not intended to make money, okay? But it allows you flexibility to roll over retained earnings for those purposes so they don't collapse into the general fund again. So it does give you some flexibility. So we're trying to move away from enterprise funds for activities, and if they are true activities, put them in activities funds. For another example, we're talking with recreation. They have several sports programs which would be good activity funds. They have Latchkey, which would be a good activities fund, because they're, in theory, if you take revenues this year, well, you can't roll them over to next year, right? But with these activities funds, the sports programs start in May of one fiscal year and in September of another fiscal year, and the accounting on that becomes very murky. So we're starting to create activity funds for those purposes. So I know I'm getting skewed, but, pardon?
I love it when you talk sexy.
Yes.
We'll leave you two alone now. So,
With that?
just to try and organize these, it strikes me that this is sort of the first meeting after the budget submission from the mayor. We should start our list of things to talk about in the budget meetings. This is probably a good one. The one-year look back on how merging the dock fund and the market house fund into the general fund worked, and how to look at that. But for the purposes of the legislation, obviously this is just clarifying in the code what we did last year. So I think it's we can probably dispose of this and then start that other conversation at the appropriate time.
I move we recommend approval to the council.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, easy enough.
So that makes a great segue to what I'm passing out right now. Staff took the liberty of creating a timeline schedule for you to talk about the upcoming budget sequence. So,
Thank you, staff.
Yeah, thank you
yes.
very much.
So what we really looked at was, as you know, the Finance Committee has to make a report to the full council in the first meeting in May. And in order to do that, this is a tentative thought process as to what can be done and should be done during that sequence of events. By also allowing on the last meeting, the summary recap and right to report and facilitate that process. The thought process is further delineated into 2 meetings per week. We were hoping for a Monday and Thursday. It gives staff, if there are issues that need to be, or schedules to need to be prepared, on a Monday, it gives us 2 days to prepare those schedules and reports. And the weekend, if you will, Friday and whatnot, to do if anything comes up on the Thursday meeting. So it does help me and my staff if we can go on a Monday, Thursday timeline. It also, we're thinking that because we're meeting on Monday, we'll be here Monday anyway, but that's just our thought process. It's up to you, of course. So the first meeting, what we thought we would do is get into a detailed presentation of the pro forma and all the other resolutions, be it capital, be it, fees, fines, whatever it is. Get that all on the table so everybody has an idea at what they're looking at. At that time, we'll give out the budget books, and we'll go through that. Then, based on conversation and feedback that I've heard from the Finance Committee, and there was a desire to hear reports from the different departments. So what we looked at is trying to create blocks, if you will, so recreation, transportation, public works, emergency management, and then general government being meeting 6. And then meeting 7 being the capital budget, 8 being ordinances, resolutions, community grants, and then again wrap up on the 9th. So that's the idea anyway. I'm sure as we go through the process, things will come up, and we can definitely address those issues as we move forward. But
I think it sounds like a good framework, just trying to match it up with the calendar. I mean, so you're thinking basically the kickoff one later this week, and then 2 per week, taking us up to the first council meeting in May where we have to deliver is the 8th, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. So you would have basically 2 meetings the week of the April 10th, 2 meetings the week of the 17th, 2 the 24th, and then the week of May 1st, 2 weeks finishing up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a couple of observations. The 24th is a Monday council meeting, which usually involves council lunch and then the council meeting. And so I guess
we could do it at 4 or no.
Well,
Well, we can start talking
yours,
about.
yours is the schedule that probably gets impacted
Yeah,
in those
I guess
places.
I'm curious, I mean, sort of how long do we think we need to allocate? If we're going to break it out this way, sort of how, timeframes of windows per.
I was thinking
thing.
Monday would be, I was thinking Thursday could be the long day.
Mhm.
I think the 6th meeting is gonna be a long day too, with all those different groups.
Yeah.
Well,
I've
we can
got
move-
tons of questions about planning and zoning
I think
and
you
law.
can probably move them.
We
Yeah.
can move them
Yeah.
around. I mean, this
Right.
is we just were looking at blocks, if you will. Okay, we got general government, we have emergency, public safety, public works, that's all we were doing. So what you want to do is
Yeah.
we have no,
Let's just
What's
talk
in the
in
race?
general terms, are Mondays and Thursdays, we're thinking sort of afternoon timeframe, right? I mean,
I was thinking on Mondays, do it in the afternoon, 4:35, and just roll over. And then on Thursdays,
4:30 or 5 on Monday, and then rolling into the council meeting?
that's just,
Yeah.
we're here, I'm being selfish, I guess. You could do it earlier that day, because I know you guys have lunches.
Yeah.
We could do it after lunch.
we could do kind of like a 2 to 4, 2 to 5.
Right
and
after
take a
lunch
break.
is a good time to catch us.
Yeah. That might be good.
That's what I'm saying. But I'd like to hear a little more, because Joe, this was something you had asked that we repeat, just saying transportation, for example. I'd kind of like to think about a little more structure. Obviously, we let the department head make whatever opening remarks they want to make, but are there nuggets of information that we want to carry forward from this when we actually are evaluating how well the pro forma meets it? And I have my own issues of, I want to make sure under planning and zoning that we're addressing the appropriate number of staff there and budget for the studies that we've never done and may well be sued over soon. And I think that there's some questions about MIT in terms of how MIT has purview over all of the different systems we have running around, like Trackit and Reportit and Granicus, none of which they purchased and none of which they really know how to service. So, I think there's a lot of getting down into the nitty-gritty, and this is our opportunity as the Finance Committee and the Council to opine on how the administration is running this business and possibly influence it by the amount of money we
So-
do or don't do.
I totally agree. I mean, I guess the order of this should be figure out if this schedule works, match it up with the days. The second question then is what order to take them in, but at some point you're gonna basically share that with them and say, Director of Transportation, you're expected to be before the Finance Committee on this day, and hopefully before then refine some specific questions you maybe would like them to have, or broad strokes that they all respond to.
I was
but-
gonna say, the key part is preparation.
Right.
And it goes a long way if we know what the questions are to funnel those out to the department heads so that they can give you a good overview and analysis of what your concerns are. So, that may be, I don't know if you want to do that, individually or as a group, but I think it does add value to the process.
Can you get us the detailed budget sooner rather than later? Yeah, that one. Not just the pro forma, with all the line item details that we normally get.
The program budgets? Or, this is all the line numbers?
Yeah, that's the one.
This is the detail. But you bring up a good
We
question.
should talk about that, yeah.
Yeah,
That includes salaries?
everything.
Because it's, what I was getting at is it's hard to organize what our questions are for these different departments without seeing what they're proposing and asking.
I move we
Good.
approve the budget.
How many active department heads are there right now?
How many acting?
Yeah.
No. Well, please.
American Park Police,
City Attorney?
City
Law,
Attorney.
yeah.
Which is great.
Yeah, because, two were eliminated last year, and that you were talking about last night.
Parks and Rec.
So, yeah, Park and Rec, Police, and,
So ideally, if we try and make this schedule work, we would meet this Thursday to start in on the pro forma, walking through it, as well as sort of the overview, which I think could be part of that exercise, could be figuring out what questions we want to give the department heads to expect to come with, as well as, Rusty, to your point, sort of specific things that we'll want to bring up when they get here, right? I mean,
Right.
half the equation is what we want them to share with us, and half is what we want to follow up with and ask about.
and if I could ask everybody to work through, Nikki,
Okay.
who will compile and facilitate
Good.
any of those questions.
I note that there's nothing on here to talk about the capper, and there's nothing on here to talk about the balance sheet, and every year we say, we're gonna get into the balance sheet instead of just the pro forma. And I think we're long overdue in getting into understanding the balance sheet, understanding timelines as opposed to cross-sectional analysis. So, and that brings up the next question, is there going to be another 5-year projections exercise?
The 5 years are, it's not on here now, but it's all tied, it's all mapped. So I can give you a 5-year projection. So.
Well, I do think we need to discuss the CAFR, because that's the audit final numbers.
No,
and
I know.
think,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So CAFR and then balance sheet.
Well, the CAFR and the balance sheet will go hand in glove.
All right.
Yeah, and the 5-year projections I would do as a spin-off to the, we could do it as part of the kickoff, only because it continues that dialogue.
Is there anything from all the work, I mean, you did and you got high praise from Steve Silvestri, all of the work you did to share with the unions. Is there anything from that work that we don't have here that would be useful in looking at?
Well, the impact is in the budget. But for everybody's familiar awareness, what we did is I took everybody's, all the employees and all the contract people, dumped it into a spreadsheet by bargaining unit. And then it had hire date, it had all the financial information that you could ever imagine. Health insurance, pension, OPEB, OPEB, Viva, everything on it. So that if we did anything, step increases, COLA, it all had a future value to it. So it had 3 years worth of analysis. So if you made what would be the impact of a 1% step, you can map that out for the next 3 years. If, not only on the salary, but on the pension and all the component parts of that. If we would have to increase health insurance by 8% versus 5%, what that would do. So it was
Incredible amount of detail.
yeah, and it was I think it's
Given how much of our annual expenditure is on salaries and expense, this was an eye-opener, getting under the hood like never before, and then that modeling capability, which I think went a long way. Did we ever get police?
Yeah.
Good. So they have agreed to a contract.
Oh, no,
So-
police, no. Police
No,
has
all
not.
right, but
agreed,
anyway,
no.
it
Fire has.
rebuilt a trust factor that was so important. We had built it up with the first IDB and demolished it with the second. But they see anything and everything that we see, and they don't have to take our word for it. They can put in their COLAs, their additional steps, the shares of where they're paying for the insurance versus what we're paying for the insurance, and model it out. They didn't have to take our word for what it would cost, which I think certainly with fire, of course, people in fire were really good at being able to use this, and I think ASME as well. Police ended up going off on a strange, squirrely place that was not monetary, was not economic, but emotional thing. But I think they accepted all the economics, right?
The economics were there.
But we'll need to look at that when we go to ratify the contracts, and hopefully we'll ratify the contracts before we finish the budget. That was the whole point of changing the time to one of the 2 points. So this may be something where it's too much detail for everyone's taste, but I think just a quick demonstration of what's there in case we say, hey, maybe we need to go back to Bruce's stuff, it would be a good idea.
Okay, so Bruce, is there the CAFR, the balance sheet, the 5-year projection, the union data, that, you know, as this agenda gets more filled out, to figure out sort of where those might fit, the issues that Ross raised, and
I would do this.
dedicate some time to those.
We can do the if it's, I'm talking for you, so.
Sure, no, please.
Do the 5-year as part of the pro forma first meeting, because I'll give you it, and then you can see what the impact is gonna roll out to be. Then the balance sheet, I have to agree with Ross, unfortunately, because I put the bug in his ear, relative to the balance sheet and the importance to understanding the balance sheet. So I would do that early.
Maybe in
I don't think
capital.
we've got enough time on the first meeting, but definitely the second meeting, entering into it. Or maybe do the 5-year and the balance sheet together. That's probably more realistic.
I thought you
And-
said balance sheet and capital would fit.
Yeah,
together.
balance sheet, I'm interchanging. Do the 5-year and the balance sheet together, and maybe combine rec and park and transportation. So that, because I think, once we get into the balance sheet, I would also like to throw out that, white paper that the FACT did, because it has a lot of, targets, if you will, that we probably should be looking at and managing to. So that would be part of that general conversation. So it'll take a little bit longer, I think, but it will set the foundation to work from.
Yeah, I think those are all good to have before we get into the department level
Okay.
So
discussion.
let's talk about, if we're gonna try and block out the schedule here, how much time do we need in each potential session? I mean, or can they vary? Is it,
I think they're going to vary,
Yeah.
but I would
you wanna block them
schedule
minimum?
2 hours apiece for them. And then, so if we, and have it early enough, so if we have Thursdays on, starting at 1, if we roll over, a little
Yeah,
bit.
you're not bumping up against, I guess, Cindy, I'm trying to think about the schedule. The only group that I know meets in here is during the day, usually on a Thursday, is that Environmental Matters tends to meet then, but I'm not sure, it kind of gets moved around sometimes, so.
But that does bring up another
Sure.
question, which is, last year we tried to have at least one of the meetings towards the end in the evening, so that people, constituents or work, could come. I don't remember it being excessively attended.
I don't think anyone came, but, yeah.
No, well, that wasn't excessive.
But yeah, I mean.
And we'd also talked about a Saturday meeting.
Understatement.
Well, maybe you can do the summary meeting and the recap meeting as the evening meeting, so.
That's where you're actually making
Yeah.
decisions and doing
And
things.
put on the calendars that the nude regatta is the 5th, 6th, and 7th, and Wednesday nights start the 19th of April.
Yes, that's why we don't want
So, I guess if we could try and, unless there's anyone has a standing conflict, half the Mondays we have council meetings and there's the lunch thing. I'd prefer not to start at 4 or 5 and try to roll into the council meeting. I'd prefer to go maybe on the heels of the lunch for a
Right.
couple hours and then
Yeah.
take a break.
Yeah.
So maybe we shoot for like 2 o'clock on Mondays,
Yeah.
2 to 4, and then Thursdays, 1 o'clock is, I mean, if you think that works, 1 to 3, and see how we can, see if that works for all these dates. So basically, starting this Thursday, 1 to 3, and then every Thursday through the first week of May, this Thursday.
Yeah, I've got the city manager, mayor, chief of staff on Monday, and the food meeting on Thursday, so we'll come. I'll come here for the first hour and then we'll leave.
Okay. So obviously it's subject to change, we can move stuff around, but if we can get those blocked out and on the schedule and share with people.
And I wanna send it out.
So hold on, so starting this Thursday, and we'll try and do 1 to 3 each Thursday.
I've got Rotary until 1:30 every Thursday.
That's fine. You wanna do 1:30 to 3:30, or?
That would be better for me.
Actually, Why don't we just do 2 to 4 for every day?
That would be best.
That would probably be easier to keep it all.
Physical therapy on Thursday, but
Like Thursday, Tuesday?
So
2 to
let's
4
just to
Mondays.
keep it easier to keep track of,
Mondays.
Mondays and Thursdays, 2 to 4. So we
Okay.
start with the same time frame, and, and then we can, so we'll start this Thursday with what is meeting number 1, and then obviously this is subject to change to figure out how to fill in. But yeah, probably 2 meetings where it's us getting into these details before we bring any department heads in, which gives us more time to figure out what to ask them.
Right.
And then if we want to try and do a final meeting somewhere around the end that is a different time in the evening or something, I think that's fine, or Saturday or whatever.
Now,
just stepped on environmental matters.
Well, does he have a set time
1:30. Yeah.
on
We'll just
Thursday,
have to change
on the
it.
20th,
Not the 20th, it's this Thursday, isn't it?
April 20th?
Oh.
Oh, that's right, we have a work sessions on Thursday, at least one work session on Thursday. So,
actually, next Thursday's Holy Thursday.
so basically between now and the end of the budget process, there's only one work session, which would be that Thursday, the 20th. So I suggest we keep this 2 to 4 framework every Monday and Thursday, and that one, do it, I mean, if everyone's fine, do it, I don't know, in the morning or something.
In the
you
morning
know,
or
10 to
at-
12 or something like that, and then there's,
Hey, we can cross that bridge when we come.
exactly,
Yeah.
but we just can't block out the room. So let's do, starting this Thursday, 2 to 4, every Thursday except the 20th, where we'll do 10 to noon. And then every Monday, 2 to 4 from here till the week of the 1st. And we'll see, I'm sure it'll get changed, but, let's just try that.
Do you
Now-
think we'll get more done with council at a work session or at the finance committee?
now, the last thing I'd like to bring up
Sure.
is, the program budget.
Yes.
It, you know, personally, you know, it provides detail, but it seems like the committee, and the council gravitate to the, detailed budget roll-up. So, your pleasure. Do you want the program budget information, or is it,
I don't want to speak for anyone else. I mean, my sense is sort of the program budget, sort of dynamic, that ship has sailed. I mean, I know it's a lot of work to put together, and if we're not using it in the way it was intended at the outset, I don't know if we need to spend a lot of time and effort on your staff's part to deliver that. But if there is someone who feels that there's a lot of value in it, I'm happy to cede to them.
and that would be, the other thing that we could do is, if, in retrospect, that if you want it, then I can go get it done, if you will.
Well, we almost got this done before Ross was here. So
Yeah, that's what,
Programmatic budget.
that's what we're talking about.
so we all agree, right?
What I said is that since we have never used it in the way it was intended to be used, and it is a lot of a burden on the staff to put it together, I'd rather not have them do that unless someone else felt a very strong need to see it, in which case I'm happy to cede to them to do it, since I'm not the one doing the work anymore.
Well, it's also, because we are constrained for time, and it would be one more document to go through. And I'm trying to find an efficient and effective use of time. And if we're not going to use the document, it's, you know, I hate to say it, but it's not as productive as.
I agree. I think it's time to put the program budget out of its misery. It's sort of the
And-
end of the road.
And then open government.
I'll defer to Nikki on that.
Joe has a question or point.
Yeah. Question on the spreadsheet that you're using. Is the spreadsheet that underlies all of this organized by program? I know it was, you did last year where you had the programs and they rolled up to the departmental.
This year is straight into this schedule. Not to mean I can't reverse engineer it.
Okay, then if it doesn't exist, I wouldn't ask for you to create it, but if you had it, it would be handy to look at.
Or if you have specific departments, I can always, whatever.
Yes, planning and zoning.
Maybe
Yeah.
zone.
I want to see the program
Mine
budget.
would be specific too, I'm like Joe, mine would probably be, recreation and parks, and maybe transportation also.
Well, transportation is already, basically, it's like, Public Works. It's already on your budget, pretty much, in the program. So, planning and zoning and recreation.
Rec and parks, so.
And Park and Recs, with the exclusion of dock, that's pretty much, it's recreation piece and the parks piece. So I'll pull out so recreation, parks, and then planning and zoning.
Especially now that it's gotten so good.
Okay, other, questions?
Move that we adjourn.
Open government is something that
Yeah. You wanna
would
talk-
allow those of us that want to do it, I'm probably thinking Joe and I, to get in and do some nice summary charts and, pie charts and human bar charts, which I find, I believe will be useful when I do a town hall meeting talking about the budget. But I think would be easy summary materials when we talk as a council.
No, I think it's a good idea. It's the question is what does that involve? I mean, are you asking for a session to sort of learn how to do it, or to ask for the
really
staff to
asking,
deliver it
is
as
it
a
loaded?
product? Yeah.
At this time, it's not loaded. The program is essentially ready to go. The budget was just made public yesterday, so I'll need to just go through and update Munis, our operating system, with these numbers, and then we can transfer it right over to OpenGov. So,
What's the name of our lady who helps us with this?
Neha,
No, maybe.
yeah.
How long will it take her to load all this?
Once it's in the system, I believe it can be done overnight, but then we'll have to take time to test and make sure that all the information carried over properly. But I mean, it's not going to be too time extensive, I would say.
So
I would say like by
suggest-
Monday, you guys could be ready to fool around with it and set up your scenarios.
Yeah, no, I think it's a pretty cool thing. So yeah, I mean, we'll
And
whatever
everyone
time
has their IDs
time
to
frame that
log
works,
in and, okay.
Right. Maybe we could have a little training session
Mhm.
day where she could come up and
Okay.
we could
Yeah.
show everybody who wants to learn how to use it, how to use it.
Okay. Okay. So I'll ask Cindy to send out an email with these dates all the way through, so people can be aware of it, and then we'll meet on Thursday to get into the meeting number 1 agenda here and start to fill in the rest of the agenda going forward. So
Very good, thank you.
This
Thank
was
you.
very helpful. I thought that
Yeah.
really set the context for getting our planning going.
we have a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move that we adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.